Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. While we wait for more people to join, I just want to go through a little housekeeping. Everyone's mics are on mute right now, but if you have any questions over the course of the presentation, please feel free to post them using the Q&A button in the Zoom console, and we'll get to them towards the end. We're also going to send a follow-up email to all registrants tomorrow with a link to an on-demand version of the webinar. So if you want to revisit it, you can. And now I'll hand you over to iGraphics' VP of Global Marketing, Don Hart.
Great. Thank you, Edward. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Yes, I'm Don Hart. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Analyst Relations here at iGraphics. Over the past year, through conversations with customers, prospects, and industry analysts, one theme has come up consistently. Organizations are moving faster than ever with AI and automation, but not always in the right order. Many teams are scaling these initiatives before they have a clear, shared understanding of how work actually flows across their organizations. And when that happens, AI doesn't simplify complexity, it accelerates it. So today's session is about the conditions that need to be in place for AI and automation to deliver real sustainable value. So here's how we'll spend our next 30 minutes or so. First, we'll look at where automation and AI tend to break down at scale. Then we'll talk about what's missing, what changes once processes are actually understood. And then finally, we'll bring it all together with why we say process intelligence before AI. So just last week, we were at the Business Transformation World Summit, and the theme this year was activating human-centric transformation for an agentic age. And the conversation after conversation started the same way. Hey, I'm under a lot of pressure to use AI. We're not quite sure where we should start, what process, who we should be working with. And many of us have seen this movie before. When RPA took off, hype drove urgency. Organizations rushed to automate tasks, often without stepping back to understand the end-to-end process. And the result wasn't transformation. It was pockets of automation, brittle workflows, and limited, hard to scale ROI. That's the rush we're talking about. First, there's pressure from boards, competitors, headlines to move fast on AI and automation. Second, under that pressure, a common assumption forms. AI will solve our complexity as we go. And then third, as this is the risky part, most organizations don't actually have clear visibility into how work flows end to end. And when those three conditions come together, organizations start scaling decisions they don't fully understand and later have to unwind them. So why faster isn't always smarter? So why doesn't moving fast actually help? The reason faster doesn't always mean smarter is that most automation and AI initiatives start locally. Teams optimize what's directly in front of them, a task, a handoff, a decision point. But processes don't operate in isolation. So when you speed up one part of the end-to-end process without understanding how it connects to the rest, you introduce three problems. First, local efficiency. You make one step faster, but you don't change the outcome. So you just move the bottleneck somewhere else. Secondly, hidden dependencies. Decisions and exceptions that used to be absorbed by people now surface at scale, and often in places that no one was watching. Then third, unintended consequences. What looked like efficiency creates rework, compliance exposure, or customer friction downstream. So speed feels productive in the moment, but without system level or end-to-end visibility, it often creates more work later. AI accelerates what's already existing. This is the core idea behind everything we're talking about today. This is the part that often gets missed in AI conversations. AI doesn't create discipline. It doesn't resolve ambiguity. It doesn't correct broken logic. What it does extremely well is accelerate what's already there. So if your processes are well defined, governed, and understood, AI can absolutely make them faster, smarter, more scalable. If your processes are broken, fragmented, or inconsistent, AI simply helps you reach failure faster and at greater scale. And if your process aren't clearly defined at all, AI introduces variability that becomes very hard to explain, govern, or trust. So the impact of AI isn't determined by the model, it's determined by the maturity of the process underneath it. And often, what's being automated isn't how work actually happens today. It's a documented version of the process created years ago. So automation doesn't usually break immediately. It breaks when you try to scale it. And at scale, three conditions show up almost every time. First, fragmented processes. Different teams automate different parts of the same workflow, each solving a local problem, and without a shared view of the end-to-end process. Second, the hidden interdependencies. Decisions, exceptions, handoffs that used to be absorbed by people now surface at speed, often in places that no one anticipated or even monitored. And at third, the siloed execution. Automation runs inside functional boundaries, system boundaries, or vendor boundaries, while the actual process crosses over all of them. So individually, these issues are manageable, but at scale, they compound. And that's where automation stops delivering value and starts creating risk. So if automation breaks at scale and AI amplifies what's existing or already there, the real question becomes what has to exist first? Not more technology, not better models, not more information. What's missing is a shared understanding of how work actually flows across the teams, across the systems, and across the decisions. A shared process reality, so everyone is working from the same version of the truth. End-to-end visibility, so changes in one area don't create unintended consequences elsewhere. And third, a continuous understanding because processes don't stay still long enough for a one-time documentation to work. Without this foundation, automation and AI will always struggle to scale. With it, they finally have something solid to build on. So before we go any further, it's worth pausing on a simple question we hear all the time. When you say process intelligent, what exactly do you mean? So first, process intelligence means end-to-end visibility across the systems, across the teams, across the handoffs, not just what happens inside one tool or one department, but how work actually flows from start to finish. Second, it includes both systems and human interactions, decisions, exceptions, workarounds, the things people do when reality doesn't match the process design. That context matters because most operational risk and delay lives right there. Third, process intelligence provides context for decisions, not just what happened, but why it happened. Without that context, organizations end up automating symptoms instead of addressing the causes. And then finally, it creates a shared operational truth. So when something changes in one area, teams can see the downstream impact instead of discovering it after something breaks. That's what we mean by process intelligence. It's not a tool, it's not a dashboard, it's a continuously shared understanding of how work really happens. Again, across people, systems, and decisions. So most organizations are very familiar with continuous improvement. You analyze performance, identify issues, launch an improvement initiative, and then apply changes once the outcomes are clear. That approach worked well when processes were stable and change moved at a manageable pace. But today, work doesn't pause long enough for improvement cycles to keep up. Continuous intelligence represents a shift in how organizations relate to their processes. Instead of learning periodically, they maintain ongoing visibility. Instead of static definitions, they develop a living understanding of how work is actually running. And instead of changing after the fact, decisions are guided as work unfolds. So the result is not more automation, it's better judgment. And people move from managing work to shaping outcomes. Huge difference. Every transformation initiative eventually reaches a moment where scale becomes the goal. More automation, more AI, broader deployment. But scale doesn't just amplify success, it amplifies everything, including the things you don't fully understand. And that's why clarity has to come first, because scale should amplify what you understand, not expose what you don't. And so, what we consistently see from leading organizations is that they don't start big. They start with one critical process, something meaningful enough to matter, but contained enough to understand. They focus on understanding before optimization, not because optimization isn't important, but because optimizing something you don't fully understand just amplifies risk. They make interdependencies visible early, so changes in one area don't create unintended consequences elsewhere. And only then do they think about scaling, automation, AI, or anything else. This is actually where many of our conversations went at the Business Transformation World Summit. We kept hearing the same thing. Under pressure to use AI, the AI hype. Leadership wants us to apply AI, but we don't know where to start, what we should focus on. What stood out wasn't the pressure, it was where the most successful organizations landed. They did not start with AI. They started with by making their processes clear enough that scaling wouldn't expose what they didn't understand. Key message there. This is the moment where things fundamentally change. When processes are understood, not assumed, not documented once, but actually understood, decisions stop being reactive, they become intentional. Risk doesn't disappear, but it becomes visible early before it turns into rework, compliance issue, or customer friction. Change no longer feels disruptive because teams can see how one adjustment affects the rest of the system. And most importantly, teams stop debating whose data is right. because they're operating from the same operational reality. This is what clarity buys you. And this is why those folks, I'm under pressure to use AI, don't know where to start, is such a common feeling because most organizations try to scale before they have this. So when we say process intelligence before AI, we're not making a philosophical point. We're describing a practical prerequisite. AI doesn't create understanding. It scales whatever understanding already exists. If processes are fragmented, AI scales fragmentation. If risk is hidden, AI will scale risk. If teams aren't aligned, AI is going to scale misalignment faster and further. But when processes are understood end to end across systems and people, things change. Decisions become intentional. Risk becomes visible early. Change happens with confidence. So that's why the organizations making real progress aren't starting with AI, they're starting with clarity. Clarity comes first, orchestration follows, autonomy earns its place. So thank you. We'll now open it up to questions. We'd love to see your questions. Just type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window and we'll answer them now.
Yeah, so we do have a question that has just come in. Before teams, before teams jump into automation, what's the best way to make sure a process is really understood end to end? In our world, processes often stretch across multiple teams and systems, sometimes to the point where it feels like too many cooks are in the kitchen. So I'm curious how you recommend avoiding automation when a process still has gaps or inconsistencies.
Yes. Again, back to what I said earlier about teams not starting to try to boil the ocean, really focus on one process, make sure it is understood from end to end in that simple process, and then scale from there, go downstream, go to another adjoining or adjacent process. Successful companies don't try to do end to end all at once. It's an evolving process, if you will.
Okay, so no other questions have come through, but maybe we want to revisit some of the questions that came up at Business Transformation World that we were talking about earlier. I know we went
Sure.
into some detail, but maybe you can expand on them. So, how do you balance the pressure to move fast with leadership expectations while still slowing down enough to gain clarity first?
Yes, that was a common question there. For most organizations, it's really about it's not about choosing speed or clarity. It's about sequencing them correctly. So the reality is leadership pressure to move fast, it's not going to go away. So, but what we've seen consistently is that slowing down just enough to understand how work actually flows ends up accelerating everything that follows. So when teams take time to make the process visible across the systems, people, and handoffs that I talked about, they reduce the rework, avoid unintended consequences, and build confidence with the leadership. And that clarity creates momentum, not delay. So rather than saying we need to slow down, the conversation becomes let's make sure we know what we're scaling. That's how organizations move fast and respond responsibly. And I also want to add to this a little bit of flavor that many of you also may be experiencing now with your AI initiatives. The ROI is not being realized. And I think that is also attributed to starting too big. You start with a smaller project, Gartner calls it crawl, walk, run. It can be that simple. When you start with one critical process and you have that fully understood, and you apply automation to that process, you do see an ROI from that, or you redesign the process and you do see an ROI from that. That can happen within weeks instead of waiting 18 months to 24 months to having the end-to-end project done. So that's another reason why I encourage people to start small.
Okay, a few more questions have come through. So, if the customer is looking for a multi-AI system impacting multiple workflows from different processes, what impact does that have? Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, so that's why the processes need to be contained in a process repository that covers the full gambit. Because now, when you have them in a repository, any impact or any change on one process, it does show up or shows the interdependencies of all the processes. And, with simulation, for example, so we have a lot of companies that will discover their process with mining, or they'll use our AI tool, PIA, Process Intelligence Assistant, which is an AI based discovery process. You can have it create the models for you, or you can ingest your standing operating procedures into it. So once you get the models in there and you want to perhaps redesign the process, because remember, a lot of these processes were documented 5, 10 years ago. Now with AI, you have an opportunity to reimagine that process. And that's really the big benefit of applying this. So now once you redesign that model of that process, you can take it through simulation and you can see what you can connect it to the other models, and you can see the downstream impact of that change before you actually implement it, how it's going to impact the rest of the organization. So very important. And that's process intelligence.
Okay, so another viewer is asking, a lot of our third parties have zero training AI models. This seems counterintuitive to individual business needs. What are the pitfalls we should look out for in zero training AI models?
I think, again, so what we see is companies are slowly adopting AI because we all know through our own experiences using AI, it's not quite ready to be making autonomous decisions yet. So you do have to have some guardrails in there, process intelligence with embedded risk and compliance at the process level will help give those guardrails to those AIs. I think that's the question that you were asking.
Okay, another question, how does BPM play a role in introducing AI?
Well, of course, BPM modeling, that's the human aspect of it. You have to have that along with mining, which is the systems part of it. You have to have all of those in defining the whole model or the underlying model.
Okay, we have a question about PIA. Is that okay? I know PIA can take a standard operating procedure and create a process map. PIA can also produce detailed documentation or walkthroughs based on a diagram. Does that documentation capability currently include SOP creation? If not, is that capability planned for the roadmap?
I don't know the answer to that, but you ingested an SOP, so I would imagine the documentation would be an SOP output, but I'll double check that. And if that person can send me an email to my email address here, I'd be more than happy to answer that.
Well, that seems to be every question. So I think we can wrap up now. Thank you very
Great.
much.